Russian President Vladimir Putin has massed over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border. Fears are soaring that an invasion is imminent and could spiral into a war directly involving NATO and the US. The brinkmanship between Moscow and Washington has become more than a headache for the Biden administration. It's dominating all facets of international news. So welcome to this edition of our special interview series here at the Washington Times. I'm Guy Taylor, the national security team leader in the Times newsroom. I've got with me Ben Wolfgang, a top Pentagon and international affairs journalist at the Times. And we also have an exciting honor here of having David Satter, a special guest for some deeper perspective on what's at stake in Ukraine and really how serious all of the geopolitical tinderbox this whole situation has become. David has decades of experience with Russia. He first was in the Soviet Union in the mid-1970s as a correspondent for the Financial Times of London. He built an illustrious career covering the Soviets. They kicked him out of the country in '82. They let him back in 1990, but finally expelled him again years after the Soviet Union had fallen, with the Russian government kicking him out in 2013 on grounds that the secret police regarded him as an undesirable. David, you've written 5 books on Russia. Your most recent, just a couple of years ago, was Never Speak to Strangers, other writing from Russia and the Soviet Union. It's really interesting. I've actually read some of it. It's an anthology of your work from the 1970s to 2019. In short, you're a leading commentator on Russia, and we're honored that you're here. So let us jump into it. We've got 30 minutes to get your take. Why don't we just start with the big, easy, obvious ones? Are the Russians going to invade?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't tell you for sure that they're not going to invade, but I don't think so. I think that the Russians will, in the end, realize that an invasion will be no joke for them either. It will cost thousands of lives. It'll inflict, if it takes place, untold damage and suffering, and it will not get them anywhere. There'll be no positive result. All they'll do is unleash partisan warfare against themselves. And most important, they'll run the threat of destabilizing the regime in Russia itself. The spectacle of people fighting for their freedom in Ukraine will have an effect on the political situation inside Russia. These are the reasons I think it's not likely to happen. But we're dealing with very unstable people. They are full of complexes. They don't worry about shedding blood. They definitely feel the insecurity of their own position and are tempted to think that war might strengthen that position. So we can't be 100% sure. But if you were to ask me, what do I expect? I expect that this will end without an invasion.
So 100,000 troops and a lot of headlines in the international news. And yet there's a debate here on a little bit on both sides of the aisle in Washington, but especially among Republicans, where there's this kind of sense of why are we so focused on this? What's really at stake here? Why do we care? I know that you and I, or professionals in national security, or journalists covering this stuff all the time, we're ready to debate that and jump into it. And the question can almost be really outrageous. But there are serious lawmakers in Washington, representatives of the American people, who say, well, isn't this an obscure foreign policy crisis over an old Soviet border that is why is the US so heavily involved in this? And how do you respond when you get thrown that question? Why does this matter? Why are we even talking about it right now?
People don't often ask me that question because I deal with people who are better informed.
Right.
Yeah. But for people who do ask that question, I would say that the system of respect for international borders has guaranteed the security of everyone for a long time. And we don't want a world in which anybody can annex any territory that they want. We want to keep the world governed by certain rules, and we want to keep the sphere of lawfulness to extend to countries that are even far from our borders, so that they don't get so that chaos doesn't begin to affect us. If let's just say that Russia decides it's going to annex part of Ukraine, and we assure them in advance that we'll do nothing or even encourage them, well, how are we going to stop them then from annexing Estonia? Well, Estonia is a member of NATO. And under those circumstances, NATO will cease to exist as a defensive alliance. That means that countries with aggressive intentions will dominate Europe. Under the circumstances, will we be able to defend our interests? And what about the commission of crimes that take place even below the level of full-scale invasion? For example, Russia's been carrying out an assassination campaign in Western Europe. Various people that they considered to be their enemies end up getting killed. The most prominent example was Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with a nuclear isotope in 2006 in London. Do we want them as the dominant power in Europe to feel that they can do whatever they want with European citizens or with our citizens? The question is, where does it stop? It's in our interest to establish a world that respects certain rules and to enforce those rules so that there's no breakdown in the system of security, which protects everyone, including us.
Are you concerned about, as we get a quarter of the way into the 21st century and we move past the era of, or perhaps we add to the era of the post 9/11 era and global jihadist terrorism, we re-enter this kind of era of great power competition with the United States, Russia, China? Are you concerned that what Vladimir Putin is doing and this threat to Ukraine could set a precedent, that an invasion by the Russians into Ukraine would be seen by Beijing as a sort of standard setter? Well, no one in the Western world, this patchwork of democracies that are trying to uphold this sort of global order of standards you're referencing, that no one will stop us, and that the Chinese perhaps could read this and go in and do things like take over Taiwan.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, all powers that have irredentist claims, and China definitely considers that Taiwan is a Chinese province and doesn't recognize it as an independent nation, will be greatly encouraged by the failure of the United States to support Ukraine in its confrontation with Russia. And I'll go further. You said that the era of, or you indicated the era of jihadist conflict may be waning. I don't think that's true at all. And that was one of the reasons why, under no circumstances should the United States have abandoned its allies in Afghanistan. The question is, why is Putin doing what he's doing at the time that he's doing it? Why is he doing it now? Let's face it, Ukraine has been an independent country ever since 1991. So that's more than 30 years. In 1997, Russia and Ukraine signed a friendship treaty. In 2010, they negotiated the conditions for the use of the port facilities in Sevastopol in Crimea, which has since been annexed by
2014
by
Russia.
By Russia. So there's no NATO has no plans at the moment to expand the alliance and include Ukraine.
This is something that's thrown out by the Russians, that there's this fear that somehow NATO is unbridled spread eastward.
Well, the point is, there's nothing there. This is not a new situation. There's been no change in the situation.
Yeah.
And there's no reason for this confrontation to have appeared at the present time, except for one, which was the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that, because that's a talking point. Speaking of lawmakers on Capitol Hill, a lot of Republicans hitting the Biden administration for that, quote unquote, setting a poor example of American leadership waning on the world stage because of the way we handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan. How much truth is there to how closely was Vladimir Putin watching that, and how did it impact his calculus?
Well, any world leader would be watching that.
What lessons did they
whether
take from it?
even if it's someone less aggressively inclined.
Yeah.
I mean, people all over the world were aware of what happened, watched what happened, and drew lessons from what happened. It's not just a question of countries that might be tempted to attack their neighbors.
Right.
Even our friends, those who rely on our security guarantee in South Korea and Japan and elsewhere, could not ignore the precedent of the United States abandoning the Afghans to their fate, and the complete callousness and cynicism with which we were ready to
Cut and run.
turn them over to a barbaric ideological enemy.
Right.
So I think, in my view of the psychology of Russia is that this is a direct reaction to that. President Biden has given the impression that he is exceptionally weak, and they know this from past. They know this from the reset policy when Biden was vice president. They know this from his unwillingness to back the assassination of Osama bin Laden. They know this from his whole congressional record, not to mention the fact that he's totally beholden at the present time to people who describe themselves as progressive and left. So under those circumstances, why not try something? Why not try to intimidate him? Let's see what we can get. Bear in mind, there's a big difference between threatening an invasion and launching an invasion. I think some of our people don't quite grasp the distinction. Threatening an invasion costs you nothing, and it can easily lead to certain positive results from the point of view of the Russians.
How long can you threaten that invasion? I mean, how long
As
can
long
you keep
as long as you want.
You can keep 130,000 people there stationed on the border for 6 months, a year. That's tenable from a Russian military perspective.
I think that it's. I mean, they've done this before, and it usually lasts a period of months. As for, I mean, there are certain expenses involved, but they're not. Compared to the expense of a war, where you begin where you begin expending ammunition, weapons, and lives, and a lot of them very fast, it's nothing.
Let's talk about what could change, even if there isn't an invasion, that threatening an invasion, what results it could have. I want to talk a little bit, just ask you first, Ben, about the force posture, the US force posture and the NATO force posture, because you've been writing about the Pentagon and Biden saying we ordering up about 10,000 American troops to be prepared for an emergency deployment. Where would they go? How many American forces are already there in the countries surrounding Ukraine? And how likely are American forces to actually get drawn into a direct shooting war with Russia?
Well, on the last point, I think probably pretty unlikely. I think things would have to really take a dramatic turn for the worse for something like that to happen. That's certainly something that I think all sides involved want to avoid at all costs. In terms of the numbers, it fluctuates between 60 and 70,000 US troops in Europe right now, the majority, of course, in Germany, something on the order of, I think, about 6,000 in Eastern Europe, the majority in Poland. So President Biden has already indicated more US troops are going to be going to the region. To what country they're headed to, that's not entirely clear yet, but it looks, those plans are already in motion and it looks like it's happening. So what I'm curious about, David, I'd love to get your perspective, is how the Russians view that. I mean, how much of a provocation is it if we send, if all 8,500 of these troops that are on high alert get deployed and they end up in the Baltics or in Poland, for example? How is that viewed in the Kremlin? I mean, is it more of a provocation, or is it brushed off?
Well, I mean, they will create a hysterical scene.
Yeah.
They will start screaming from every rooftop that this is threatening Russia.
Yeah.
But they aren't stupid, and they know that it isn't.
Right.
And they know that, and they will not take any actions on the basis of those deployments. And in fact, they know perfectly well the United States has no intention of using its own troops in
Actually defending Ukraine.
defending Ukraine or Ukrainian territory. But the best defense is the best defense is a strong offense, and they're going to preemptively create conflict, especially verbal conflict, over anything that the US and NATO decide to do in their own defense.
Yeah.
But it won't change. Won't change anything, and they're perfectly aware that they're not threatened by Ukraine. There are no Ukrainian troops massed on the border with Russia. They know that they see that the Ukrainian armed forces have adopted a defensive posture to defend their own territory, and this is not a secret to them. So I think that what we're seeing, of course, is an attempt by them to achieve two goals, really. One is to, if possible, extract concessions, and the other is to call attention to themselves, to demonstrate to the world how powerful they are, how the world has to pay attention to them. And both of these things have benefits inside the country for any Russian political leader. Russian people see, oh, look, our leader is important. Immediately there are negotiations everywhere to listen to the voice of Russia, to listen to the demands of Russia. That's why, in fact, it doesn't even pay to start these negotiations, because there's nothing really to discuss.
But with regard to negotiations or concessions, I want to just add this. We've got American troops, the possibility of that, but what about the American strategic force posture? What about nuclear weapons? What about ballistic missile silos? What about missile defense? And the positioning of American assets and NATO assets in the region? Is that something that the Russians are trying to get a push back and get a concession?
They are, and it would be a shame if they got it. Because that's the Russian love of getting something for nothing. As Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev said, what's yours is what's mine is mine. What's yours is negotiable. And
especially at a moment where we don't have a New START treaty that's been kicked down 5 years. We also have a posturing by another great power now, or an emerging great power, with Chinese military expansion in the region.
Well, they would love to affect our strategic calculations and win concessions, but concessions are necessary only in order that they can more effectively intimidate their neighbors.
Aren't they already capable of intimidating the European Union and Western Europe by really controlling the biggest source of natural gas used for heating homes and all kinds of other things in the heart of Western Europe? And now they're making a second gas pipeline that's going to go right into Germany. The United States has kind of waffled on how to respond to this. The German government has accepted the the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Aren't the Russians already in a position to exert quite a bit of influence over what's going on in Europe?
Well, they're seeking to, and that's one of was one of the clear goals of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, to isolate Ukraine, to minimize Russian dependence on the Ukrainian pipeline network, while at the same time maximizing Western European and especially German dependence on Russia as a supplier of gas. But there's only so far that can go. We are looking for alternative sources of gas for Western Europe, and Russia, is dependent on the revenues that result from the sale of that gas. Their attempt now to use gas as a strategic weapon should be a warning to the countries of Western Europe of the dangers of dependence on Russia and viewing relationships with Russia as purely commercial, which they never are.
Yeah.
I think that, but we don't want to add to that a situation in which our force calculations and our strategic configuration in Europe and elsewhere is influenced by Russian pressure. It needs to be influenced only by our own national security needs. But this is what this whole performance, which is taking place right now, is intended really to achieve various goals that are peculiar to the small group of people who rule Russia and that have no relevance and no benefit for the Russian people as a whole, for the Ukrainians, for the West. What you have in Russia, and this is the thing that people don't, and many of our, as you say, American conservatives who are exercising their First Amendment rights and discussing these
part of this
issues.
debate of should we be partnering with, why are we partnering with
Ukraine
Ukraine
instead
and
of
not
Russia,
Russia? This
right.
is a big
Well,
Tucker
this
Carlson
is well,
issue
I
recently.
I don't want to mention anyone in particular, and we have free speech in the United States. People don't have to be informed in order to express an opinion. And I don't know how we could encourage people to be better informed before they express an opinion. Not sure it's even possible. But the fact is that Russia is a country in which a small kleptocratic group monopolizes power and property. Literally, by some estimates, 100 families or 100 groups, small groups, control 35% of the country's wealth. It's a phenomenal concentration of wealth in the hands of people who've basically stolen it. They are extremely insecure psychologically in their hold for power. We know this because many of these people have created kind of what they call in Russia reserve airports. Homes and lives outside of Russia and places they can get to quickly if there's a crisis in Russia. It's one of the reasons that private airplanes in Russia sell so well, so that people can make it a getaway if they need to. But this insecure, kleptocratic, undemocratic, and greedy group, and also murderous because they've committed terrible crimes, is immensely insecure. And they are perfectly capable of staging this whole thing in order to, first of all, intimidate the West, make the West less willing to hold them account for their crimes, and second of all, consolidate the Russian people around a regime which doesn't serve their interests.
So how can we impact those people you're talking about? I always ask the question of sort of what gives Putin and the circle around him pain from a perspective of economic sanctions? What do we have left to kind of influence?
We have a lot. We have quite a lot left. Yeah.
And how do we go? What would be the most effective way to go about that to impact their decisions?
They're experts on the Russian economy and on sanctions. their exports, oil exports are largely denominated in dollars. We can, there's a lot we can do to inflict. We can, cut them off from the international transfer system, the SWIFT, so-called SWIFT system. No, there are many things that can be done. We can, for one thing, impose personal sanctions on Putin and seek out his assets.
Would that work? You think that would impact how he...
Well, definitely. But the point is that that is not the most important thing.
Okay.
The most important thing is to be truthful about their crimes. The thing that we should have been discussing in Geneva and elsewhere was not the ridiculous demands that the Russians are making, which are non-starters. The idea, I mean, no nation is going to allow Russia to make its foreign policy for it, and certainly not the United States. And even going to Geneva to discuss such a thing is itself a concession. The most important thing for the US to discuss with Russia right now is the destruction of the Malaysian airliner in 2014, a passenger plane with 300 passengers shot out of the sky by a Russian anti-aircraft battery manned by a Russian crew. There are a whole string of acts of terrorism and assassination and murder that the US should seek to discuss with Russia, because it is in our interest that the Russian people be aware of them, including the process through which Putin came to power in the first place. With the apartment bombings in 1999. These things are never brought up.
Do you think if the United States were to take a more confrontational posture and raise these types of specific issues in the international forum, that allies from Western Europe would rally behind this focus, and also allies in Eastern Europe would rally behind them? Does the United States have support to do this? What would the international reaction?
I'm not sure that the United States at the present time has the intellectual wherewithal
to push this, or the civil
but
system.
some issues should be raised regardless.
Right.
The shooting down of MH17 affects every international air passenger that was shot down. That plane was flying in one of the most heavily traveled international air corridors in the world. At the time it was shot down, there were 4 planes, and air traffic control has confirmed this, that were within range of the Buk anti-aircraft battery, which fired the fatal missile, and they were all passenger planes.
And you feel that the Russian intelligence knew of this, was involved in it, and that they
the evidence is it was done. It was a deliberate act of mass murder and terror, intended specifically to draw the Western powers into an effort to stop the Ukrainian advance against the separatist enclaves in eastern Ukraine.
And
now
the separatist enclaves where there are Russian speakers as well, right? I mean,
it's mostly Russian speaking, but there are areas of Ukraine outside of the separatist enclaves that are mostly Russian speaking, and that nonetheless are pro-Ukrainian.
Do you expect Moscow to offer some sort of formal recognition for some of those enclaves? Is that kind of a chess?
Well, they're already doing so.
Yeah,
they're already doing so. They're paying pensions, and they've given documents to the residents, as they've done in the case of the residents of South Ossetia, who which has been de facto annexed by Russia, and that's a part of Georgia. No, the thing is that to blunt this aggressive drive to establish contact with the Russian population, to make clear to Putin that we're not fools, and that his propaganda stunts are not taken seriously. One of the best ways to do that is to talk about real issues. and if he will not engage, then we can certainly we have enough influence in the world to raise these issues on our own.
As we move to to close this out, because we're getting a little bit short on time, I wonder if you can opine for us about this, the end game for Vladimir Putin. We're at this moment when we look out at how the human species is organized around the world, and we have a couple places where there are these governments. We could look to Iran, where there's the Iranian supreme leader has been there for a generation, same power structure. You look to China, now Xi Jinping is making moves to be president of life, same power structure. You look at North Korea, there's a regime that's changed hands, been in power now for multiple generations. We look at Russia, and Putin has now been in power about 2 decades and has made moves maybe to try and stay in for life. What is the end game for him as someone who's really studied this now for more than the second half of your career? You're one of the preeminent people knowing the inside of this. What is your take on how Putin sees the end game? Does he stay in for life? How does he see the landscape of governments going into the next 20 years?
Well, I think you've put your finger on it, that his goal is to be president for life, and to make sure that the people around him support him with the understanding that he will protect their wealth and power. It's frequently said in the U.S. that he's a 19th century imperialist, that he wants to create an empire, he wants to restore the Soviet Union. And the Russians put out that version because they know Americans will repeat it. But the reality is that this is a group that came to power with an act of terror against its own people, and has no higher ambition than to continue to hold power and to remain unchallenged, and despite the abuses that they inflict on their own country.
I think with that, David Satter,
Yeah.
Ben Wolfgang,
Absolutely.
thank you so
Pleasure.
much. I'm Guy Taylor at the Washington Times. I hope that we've been able to give readers some fodder here to deepen their perspective and their views on the situation unfolding. Thank you so much for joining us for this special interview series at the Washington Times, and have a good day.